wonderful to be here as part of PRELUDE. This feels so formal because there's also here. And thank you to Frank and Andrew for inviting me, and Alyssa and the whole PRELUDE team. And of course to David, who's my special guest today. So I just published a book, which I'm going to show you a slide here. And this is the book. And like I said before, I've invited one of the artists that I feature in the book, David Levine, to join me, and he's going to be taking part in a conversation. So the evening's going to be like this. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes, a little formally, reading from my notes, where I'm going to summarize the ideas and kind of the main thrust of what I write about. And after that, I'll briefly introduce and contextualize David's work. And then we'll move here and have a more informal conversation. And then we'll open it to you guys to ask questions and open it out. So this book is a culmination of many years of attending or following the work of artists who were staging plays or devising performance outside theaters and institutional venues. I was drawn to the use of non-theater spaces for performance. So over the last 2 decades, artists have generated countless ways of reimagining and activating found spaces for performance, which continues to evolve different modes of participatory engagement, immersive techniques, framing devices, installation art, and environmental design. So the term site-specific itself is not specific enough and came to be the common and generic term that lumped together a diverse range of approaches. It had become vast and vague, robbing the term of any use in categorizing a specific and important genre. So I was looking at the phenomenon of the diverse approaches to site specificity. How were artists and performances engaging with site? What sites did contemporary theater practices engender? How did live performance negotiate such sites? And by the way, I didn't put that, that's me in the photo. When I was looking for a photo of Annie Doris and Spokioki, that's the photo that came up. Okay, so I attended this performance in 2013. This is an image of the Quiet Volume. This performance took place on the 3rd floor of NYU's Bob's Library. It was co-created by Ant Hampton and Tim Etchells of Forced Entertainment. It was a self-generating performance. There were no actors, only us, the participants. And upon my arrival at Bob's, I was paired with the only other audience member who sat down next to me. The 2 facilitators gave us iPods with earbuds, cued to begin simultaneously. On the long table in front of us were 3 novels and a yellow notebook. Throughout the Quiet Volume, a soft voice guided us through several instructions. We were told to read passages from the novels in front of us, which included José Saramago's Blindness and Kazuo Ishiguro's When We Were Orphans, among others, to consider a setting for them, and to choose an image from Gabriel Basilico's photo book, Cityscapes. At some moments, the voice was silent, substituted by sounds that theatricalized what we were reading. Footsteps, a baby crying, people talking, a church bell. At another point, the voice asked us abruptly to stop reading and to remember the last word we had just read. I remember mine was disaster. The Quiet Volume was an experience that mediated presentation, what is really there, with representation, what is imagined to be there, a sort of intimate and solitary experience taking place in public, where nothing external happens, really, except in our own minds. To people around us, at the library, the students especially, they would not know that anything out of the ordinary was in fact happening. Yes, the performance, which was produced by a theater, in this case PS 122, took place inside a library, away from a theatrical building. And it clearly engaged with an act commonly associated with libraries, generally reading to oneself. But what was most compelling, figure that out later, was the negotiation between the various sites of presence, the real, the imaginary, the here and now, our memory. In this sense, the quiet volume exemplifies a search for new theater forms that can take place in a space that is easily transformable and not expensive to operate. Most importantly, the quiet volume, site-specific, appears nowhere in the marketing materials, nor do the artists themselves use the term to describe the work. However, it is evident that it took place at a specific location that is determined by the content of the piece. It was participatory, immersive, solitary, eventful, stationary, and mobile all at once. So both Etchells and Hampton are artists who have individually engaged with creating live art in alternative theatrical locations and public spaces in the past. But what has become most prominent in their work, or at least prominent in their work, along with the work of other artists devising theater today, David Levine among them, are the approaches that they have developed to establish new modes of performance that move beyond the site-specific, but which nevertheless incorporate cross-disciplinary strategies that are related to site. So on the one hand, I observe in these artists a desire to move away from the theater building, black box, theater auditorium, gallery space, you name it, for various reasons, political, aesthetic, financial, and thus a need to find new forms that accommodate their work. On the other hand, there is simultaneously a desire to move away from theater as a medium. And the first step is to find a new space that is not associated with theater, which leads to the question, do new forms of theater generate new spaces, or conversely, do new spaces generate new forms of theater? Or both simultaneously. So let's look at 4 hotels. 4 quick examples. Hotel 1. So this is a performance by Gob Squad. Room service helped me make it through the night at the Intercity Hotel in Hamburg. It lasted from 10 o'clock in the evening until 4 o'clock in the morning. The performance invited the audience to lie down in sleeping bags in the hotel's lobby to watch, via live streaming video feed, 4 performers try to be themselves in their private hotel rooms. None of them can sleep. Instead, they kill time in cold baths or by finding comfort in the solace of the hotel minibar. Each is being watched by a surveillance camera, by us, sharing their moments of fear and boredom as they sit out a long and sleepless night. As the night progresses and their boredom peaks, the performers try to connect with the audience through phone calls, in some cases inviting them to their private rooms while everyone watches, in a plea to help them make it through the night. So spectators here are therefore free to choose their own level of engagement in this hotel experience. Hotel 2. So this is an image of, this is Jim Fletcher starring in Richard Maxwell's Showcase, which took place in, where I saw it, Manhattan's New York Hilton Hotel and Towers, room 2705. Showcase is a play written to be performed in any working hotel room. The main character is Jim, there he is, a lonely businessman who prepares to attend an important conference and reconcile his struggles with the world beyond the hotel walls. A limited number of audience members witness this Jim character for each performance, as many as can fit on the other queen-size bed opposite his. When I saw it, there were about 10 people in the room. The event is fully scripted and fictional, except of course for the business people who walk the hotel's hallways just outside the room. Hotel 3. So while room service and showcase are theatrical events staged in fully operational hotels, Dominique Hubert's Hotel Savoy led spectators one at a time into a fabricated and surreal interactive hotel experience. Each participant is the sole guest of this once occupied and apparently haunted building. This was, by the way, also produced by PS 122. They encounter characters throughout the space and follow an actual storyline. It was part art installation, part immersive experience. Hotel Savoy combined the building's environmental features with some of its historical events to create a kind of off-kilter world, an alternative time-space dimension where nothing is quite what it seems. And Hotel 4, so this is an image of Hotel Maids by Lola Arias. This was a theatrical installation with no performers, where the audience walks inside 5 rooms that display the inner life of the staff who clean them. As she describes it herself, each visitor adopts the role of a chambermaid responsible for 5 rooms per hour. But instead of cleaning, the audience spends the hour walking through the 5 rooms where they discover portraits of the cleaning staff, films, original voice recordings, and photographs that bring to light something of the invisible spirits who clean up after others. So in this one, spectators are led in one at a time every 10 minutes. The exhibit is open for 8 hours at a stretch. It's kind of like a dramaturgy of sight. Arias' project uses real space with the otherwise ignored labor that enables it. Okay, so room service, all these 4 hotels, Showcase, Hotel Savoy, and Hotel Maids, have little in common, other than the fact that they all take place inside a hotel. The landscapes, approaches, logistics, and artistic influences of these hotels are each very different, making this locational similarity all but irrelevant. Instead of generic hotels, we get tailor-made experiences with varying degrees of interactivity and participation at specially manipulated sites. So in the book, I trace the genealogy of site-based work, historicizing it through the 20th and 21st centuries, including theatrical legacies of political and street theater, the avant-garde theater of the 60s and 70s, as well as visual art lineages of minimalist sculpture, installation art, land art, and public art practice to show how site specificity today in contemporary performance has shifted from an experimental staging practice to a more experiential event. So how did I do that? Or what was my methodology? So offsites is the terminology I use to think about these strategies that take place outside traditional theater buildings, but that more importantly, engage with the experience of space, place, and/or situation as an integral component to the very fabric, structure, and content of the work. The term off-site is a common phrase to characterize something that is happening in a location that is other than the location from which it originates. I'm going to complete the job off-site. In other words, it takes place somewhere else, not here, but there. It signals a connection between spaces. Off-sites thus acknowledges the inherent contradictory essence of working off-site rather than on, and therefore with the site. A performance can belong to a site while simultaneously work in reaction to it. The term suggests both a relationship with and an independence from a site. So I think of the experiences of immigrants, like my own families, and the millions of refugees for whom identity is linked to this on-off conundrum, always in relation to both where they are and where they are not. Site is therefore never a whole. It is always incomplete. It is off-kilter. It is off. This off-sidedness is carried everywhere. It is imagined, it is real, it is embodied. It is often invoked, but not necessarily materially present. So I began this book thinking about how site specificity might allow for the creation of new spaces for performance and new forms of theater. I had originally assumed that any conclusion or epilogue would address new technologies, such as advances in virtual reality, and how a variety of digital spaces might allow for the creation of alternative off-sites. But our current moment suggests otherwise, that developing experiences that create a real coming together, an experience that offers a relation between sites, will become more and more important, actually. The search for ways to make off-sites presenced, embodied, and experienced, bless you, and through life forms has become of crucial importance. Off-sites tend to run counter to official sites. At the same time, they are deeply connected to them. The presence of off-sites therefore allows for a transposition between sites. They are more fluid, more inclusive. Instead of the site-bound or site-specific, we might want to look beyond sites in order to make what is off, what is out of bounds, present, moving away from exclusionary sited practices. So how will artists continue to make off-sites present? What can performance offer in terms of making off-sites visible? So that's kind of the end of the formal, God, that feels better without the mic. It's more. So that's the kind of end of the formal presentation of the book, so you kind of get a little bit of an idea of what, obviously I can't talk about everything in 10 minutes, so I really encourage you to buy the book. It's on sale right outside. But I wanted to introduce David's work before we sit down for a longer conversation and kind of tell you a little bit about some of the pieces that I write about. I specifically talk about his work in one of my chapters. The chapter is called Situating Theater, and it's on disciplinary sites. So disciplinary meaning like art versus theater versus performance art, performance studies. So disciplinary sites. So this kind of territorialization of the disciplines. How do we situate theater? Just get the slide. So, well, before I tell you about his, so for those of you who are not familiar with his work, David is an artist equally invested in both theater practice. He rehearses with actors, he uses scripts, he collaborates with playwrights and dramaturgs, sometimes also designers, and visual art histories of performance art, endurance art, body art, land art, happenings, conceptual art. His work often embraces both the blatant theatricality so abhorred and hated by many art enthusiasts, as well as the conceptually abstract tactics often dismissed by theater makers. His performances frame theater or situate theater as a kind of discursive device located site-specifically at the intersection of interdisciplinary legacies, where both craft, making fake blood look real and pretending it is, and conceptualizing the craft, unveiling the theatrical apparatus, are simultaneous and conflated. So that's confusing. I'm going to show you examples. So I first met David when I hosted a symposium here on site-specific performance when I was kind of a student a long time ago, 2006. And there, David was talking about a show he was about to premiere in Germany in 2007 called Bound Theater. I don't know if I'm saying it right. And this actually means farmers' theater. So for the piece, Levine hired actor David Barlow, who's there, to interpret the role of Flint from Heiner Müller's 1961 play The Resettler. They rehearsed for 3 weeks, the time allotted by Actors Equity, in a studio in New York City, practicing how to plant a half a ton of potatoes as close as possible to the way they had done it in East Germany. He then did this on location in Brandenburg, Germany, where spectators were bussed in to see this, on 2 acres of land adjacent to the Biorama Project Center, which is now a center for the study of interrelationship of art, design, ecology, and tourism. I mean, it has its own interesting background. For 10 hours a day, he essentially turned farming into an endurance performance. So in this case, by conceptualizing theater, that is framing the viewing circumstances in order to determine the experience, and theatricalizing endurance art, by having an actor really plant half a ton of potatoes while simultaneously faking it, he was acting, Levine's Bautheater demonstrated a contemporary kind of site specificity which resituated both the play, Heiner Müller's play, on location, and theater as a discipline and a form of discourse. I'm going to show just 2 more, then move on. So this is Habit. I saw this, I know you developed it in 2011. I saw it in 2012 as part of Crossing the Line in New York City before the Essex Street Market was actually a market. In this one, Levine shifted the expectations audiences might have when they go see a show, as he did with Bautheater. This time he put the actors inside a 4-walled, fully functioning house designed by Marcia Ginsburg with an operating fridge, and you can see it here, stove, sink, and toilet, operating toilet, where they enacted a typical realist play that was written by Jason Grody. The script was performed in consecutive loops that ran for 6 hours a day, hence the need for food and plumbing. I mean, the actors have to, they get hungry, they have to go to the bathroom. Once you were inside the space, and by the space I mean the audience is like out here, you're not really in the set, okay? You could circulate outside the set, aka the house, and peer through curtains and windows to watch the actors work at pretending. So Habit situated theater outside its conventional theatrical context, didn't really need its viewers or audience to kind of, happen, asking us to view it as something else. We could say it was both an object, like a ready-made in the visual art sense, and a show in the theater sense, all at once. And finally, that's another photo of Habit. Private Moment, I couldn't choose between these 3 photos, they were all so good. It's like zoomed in. So for this is actually, this is one of the scenes for Private Moment. This is called Cruel Intentions. So for Private Moment, David took scenes from 8 movies and restaged them in the exact locations where they were originally filmed throughout Central Park. Live actors in costumes comparable to those in the films enacted in continuous loops iconic scenes from among others, Woody Allen's Bullets Over Broadway, Wes Anderson's Royal Tenenbaums, and this one is Roger Kumble's Cruel Intentions, the 1999 flick, very famous flick. The piece was concerned to do away with the conventions of theater going and how we perceive theater, almost like tricking us into thinking we're actually not watching what we are watching, so that it can become something else. So just to explain, there was no sign here that said there's a show. You just kind of had to find it. So unless you knew to look out for a show, there were just people repeating a kiss for I think 6 or 8 hours. 6 hours over and over. So we're really hard at acting. So Levine's form of site specificity, I would say in Private Moment and much of his other work, is a very deliberate attempt to interweave and therefore question disciplinary histories that define, separate, and categorize theater versus art histories. It is a playful encounter with preconceptions, labels, and marketing ploys. After all, what better way to stage a concept than by theatricalize it without, God forbid, making a show. So that's kind of a little bit of background on David. And now I think we can sit for a more informal part of the conversation. I didn't introduce his 2 other works, and I'm going to have him talk about those later. Yeah. So, David, what are you thinking? I'm just kidding. So a lot of the, what I wanted to start with is that a lot of this work clearly, I keep hearing or seeing the word framing. And I mean, we can talk about museums in a second, but now in terms of, there's so much theater being in museums and going other places. But before we go there, how do you kind of conceive of these works, and why were you so into the people not, I should move it. Why especially in this one were you so interested in not having a frame, like not people knowing that that this was art? And can you talk a little bit about framing in general?
Yeah, this was also, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for doing such a careful thing about my work. So when we were talking, this was in a group show that was in Central Park that put up by Creative Time, and when we were, which is a public art organization, and when we were talking about doing this, one of the sticking points again and again actually wound up being signage, and because I wanted things as I tend to do, I wanted them as invisible and unsatisfying and unpleasurable as possible. And the Creative Time was, rightly like, well, our funders are not going to be really enthused about blowing all this cash on something they can't find or see. And I was like, yeah, but if this gets to the framing thing. So what we finally settled on was that they would print a map, like a bird watcher's map. It was actually based on bird watcher's maps, and they designed it, but then they were like, okay, and we'll have a still. I was like, no, you can't have a still. So they actually made these really cute little sketches, like one little like cartoonish drawing of each scene. And I can't necessarily justify this, but it basically, for me, what I wanted out of this was sort of 3 different levels of spectatorship, which is that there would be people who had the map and who went looking for it, and that would be one way of encountering it. And then there was another way of encountering it, which is just not noticing at all. And then there was a third way of encountering it, which is not knowing that it was happening, but you would see a well-dressed young black man talking to 2 kind of bedraggled, teens, like at a certain spot on the Upper East Side, and be like, man, that looks a lot like 6 Degrees of Separation. Or you would see these 2 women making out and be like, let's say you're having a picnic in that part of the park, and you wouldn't notice for 40 minutes that these women kissed each other every 6 minutes. But eventually you'd notice, and then I would watch people doing this, and someone would get out a phone and then find the clip and then realize it. So there were...
But also you didn't know who else was there to see it and who was just at the park, which
right,
is
and who
really
was just at the
interesting because
park.
you started people watching the other people.
Or you'd go looking for it, and you'd, somebody wrote about it for Vice, and he was trying to write about the Bullets Over Broadway reenactment, but he'd never seen it. But the most theatrical thing that was happening in that area was a Jordache shoot, and he thought that was my piece, so he wound up writing about that as... So these things would these unregulated these random encounters would happen with the work, and I like the idea that you would just have a different experience of it, that some people would have one experience, other people would have other experiences, and that they could all be standing next to each other and not necessarily... Then we had to hire security because a bunch of dirty old men started leering at the women making out, and we had to hire security, but the security was plainclothes because I insisted it couldn't be flagged as this thing. So then we had a secret guy sitting there watching to protect these women who nobody else knew about as well. But I think the larger, so basically the issue is that I didn't want these things framed, and then the question is, why don't you want these things framed? And I think that generally, for me, the strongest, if you had to define theater, or if you had to define theater against visual arts performance or against art, it wouldn't actually have anything to do with the actual thing that people are looking at. I would actually probably define all of these disciplinary things as ways of seeing. And theater is a way of being an audience that is different from art as a way of being an audience or a spectator. They generate different kinds of spectators. There's the minute and so for me, I'm not really super comfortable with either way of seeing things. So I'm not that invested in being this is this or that is that. It's just to me when you're seeing something that's been branded or marketed to you by an art institution, you go in with a different set of expectations. They're minor, they're subtle, but they're decisive than when something is being marketed or produced by a theater situation. You become a different kind of watcher. So, and I have commitment issues, and I just sort of I didn't want to actually I generally don't want to be defined by either. So there's and sometimes, because I have commitment issues, I'll give shifting explanations for why I do what I do, but sometimes I'm the theater I want to make, I can't make in theaters. So the reason I tend to work more in museums is that museums let me make the theater I want to make, and that has a lot to do with the encounter with the work, and it has a lot with how spectators come into it, how spectators run into it, and it has to do with other things too. There's stuff that I'm interested in that theatrical presenters aren't interested in, formally or content-wise, but that visual arts institutions are interested in, formally or content-wise. So
this is a good segue. I was going to ask you about looping. Is that, because and you can talk about your new work in a second, but I was interested why you introduced the looping for a few of your pieces, and not so much when you then move to museums. So is that because you want people to see theater differently when it's not in theaters, or what's the notion of looping?
Well, no, it always loops. It loops. It always loops one way or the other. And actually, it's funny because I had a conversation with someone the other day who was asking me what I did, and I explained it, and they were like, oh, so it's like Sleep No More. And I was like, well, not really, because because I don't actually believe in interaction, and and I don't believe in immersion, and they were like, oh, it's like Tina Segal. I was like, well, not exactly, because they're trained actors, but the reason I got into the loop originally was, I mean, everybody came up with the certain wave of stuff. Just everyone sort of came up with it right around 2004 to 2007, and that includes Segal and me and a bunch of other people, and they came up with it. Marina Abramovich, everyone. I mean, that's a slightly different story, but it came up with it. We all came up with it for a bunch of different reasons, I think. And for me, as I'd been drifting my way out of theater, I'd gotten more and more into the mechanisms of theater and more fascinated by, like, the job of being an actor, say, and doing the same show night after night after night, and having to sell it, as a new thing night after night after night. And when I started really thinking about, this happened, actually, it was like my encounter with Nauman that did it.
Encounter with who?
With Bruce Nauman.
Oh, yeah.
But there was all this endurance work that involved repetitive tasks, and I'd be like, ah ha ha ha, that's just like acting. But that's never apparent, because theater was generally really invested in creating this illusion of a unique event, and that requires that it only happened once a night. So I was like, well, if I turn up, that's a low frequency loop. So if I turn up the frequency of the loop, then I can put the work on display as much as the acting. What I was really interested in was the work. So for me, originally, the loop wound up being a way of, like with something like Habit, of on the one that you didn't have to efface the work that went into it, and that the work was just as interesting as the representation.
You mean the craft?
Yeah. Oh. But that's just the craft, but actually the work, like the paid work. Like the very first project I ever did in our context was filing equity contracts for actors to go to their day jobs. And then they would, but so I think I like, this is actually something I learned, like watching The Lion King, was that, was you could actually show how everything was done. People could have this split consciousness. They would know how things were done, and they could still be really moved by it. And so, and I was like, and I had this sort of Brechtian point of view combined with a kind of real commitment to realist theater, and I was like, I want you to be moved by it, I want you to respect the actor's craft and what they can do, but I also don't want to, I'm allergic to the idea of an event, and I don't want to hide the fact that it's work. So I started trying to create these situations, and the loop seemed the way of doing both, because the thing is, it got rid of the sense, and this is really what I picked up from, it got rid of the sense of event. And once you got rid of the sense of event, spectators were less focused, weren't like zeroing in on the actors to see if the actors are less tested when you get rid of the sense of event. And if the actors are less tested, that means the actors can be freer to fuck around, because it's not make or break every time. And then if the actors are freer, then they've got more of a chance to kind of redeem the promise that was made to them in grad school, which is that it can be really live and moment to moment and all this kind of shit that you actually, for a bunch of logistically completely legitimate reasons, can't actually do when people are paying $60 a ticket and there's a rake, and you might roll an ankle and there's no health insurance. And I mean, like, so these were, yeah.
Well, no, my next question is, could you not test those things out in theater buildings or in theaters? Was it the institution of theater that wasn't letting you do that? Like, why then move out?
Because, well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that I don't think theaters, to begin with, logistically, I don't think theaters would have been particularly interested in that, in terms of content. In terms of logistics, they wouldn't.
Like the gatekeepers, you mean?
It's not. It's just the thing is that there's not.
Yeah, that's why, because it gets big. It's not part of the season.
Here's the really basic thing, which is, which we'll just jump over the logistical stuff, which is that you watch differently when you're spending money, and a lot of what happened when I was in Berlin, where tickets were cheaper, and going to theater was a much more casual and disposable activity, was that the actors were much freer to fuck around, partially because they had health insurance and other things, and improvise on stage. But that was a relationship that had been established between the audience and the performers. Not every theater. Most theaters in Berlin are like American theaters, but there were a couple that were much weirder. And so for me, getting rid of the idea of like, I paid for this, give me a show. It starts at 7:30. That kind of attention, I was much more into the very casual attention that people paid in museums and art galleries, and I didn't feel like you could, because the other great thing about a loop is that you can come and go, you can take it or leave it, like you can drift in and out. It's always available. So I felt like what I was really doing was turning down the pressure on everybody. I was turning down the pressure on audience, and I was turning down the pressure on the performers by creating this sort of 3D situation, and I did not feel like that was doable given the kinds of arrangements that theater internally in terms of producing a show, but also externally in terms of like selling tickets. I didn't feel like that was going to be feasible in a theater, on top of which I also felt like I needed to get away from an auditorium architecture. And Philip Byther had this like really evil phrase for like site-specific dance at some point, where he was like, yeah, it's just dancing in front of buildings. And I felt like people were gonna, this is something you quoted, if it was produced by a theater, people were going to bring the theater with them in their heads, no matter where they saw it. Whereas I felt as though if it was produced in an alternate way, I could kind of get rid of that or hopefully I could sort of get rid of that from the beginning. And so that's what.
Well, this is a perfect segue to talk about, he just did a piece at Brooklyn Museum, and then maybe you can talk about that, and then we can talk about that.
But I want
yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, one other thing is that you can't do Habit in a theater. Like, you can't do like a piece like Habit, which is like you basically have to build a full house in a theater. You can't do this. You can't have a guy farm for 10 hours a day, in a theatrical setting. Like, there's all sorts of things you just can't do.
But we could also say now there's new forms of theater spaces. You can think, or contemporary performance. This is PRELUDE. The Armory. Habit would be perfect at a place like the Armory.
Well, except
I haven't been to the new Shed, but
right,
that's what they claim.
Fuck this Shed.
Bad.
Sorry if anyone's from the Shed, but fuck this Shed.
That's what I'm saying now, that all these art people are kind of hyping up these spaces
right,
for...
but this is the problem, and this was always the thing about, like, this is also, as soon as people are paying a ton of money, it kind of doesn't matter what the space is. As soon as people are showing up at 7:30 and like paying a ton of money, it kind of stops mattering. And even then, even at the Armory, the encounter with Paul McCarthy is completely different than the encounter with like some crazy shit from Donmar. It's not, or former. Like when you see the Paul McCarthy installation, it feels one way, and when you see when you see the Damned, it feels you already have that thing. So, but this was a long time ago when I was working. This wasn't that possible, and it also also wasn't. It's not like PS 122 and Crossing the Line produced Habit. So we did it in an alt space, and it had. It had been developed as a visual arts project, but it's not like it was different then. So,
no, this is definitely a new phenomenon.
So
what does this work?
How does this work? Back to the loop thing. It's still always loops. I find different ways of looping it. So the farming work was looping in a way, just because all labor is repetitive. This looped, in this case I wrote a monologue that was 50 minutes long, but 8 different actors learned it. So whenever you walked in, there would always be an actor performing this. So it's the endless availability. The real thing that got me into loops was video loops, and I was like, why can't we apply this to performance? What would happen? What kind of attention do you pay? Do you pay a different kind of attention if you know it's looping? Yada, 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 yada. And so the experiment with Habit was really to see if I've alienated everything, but it's a real melodrama, which is what I asked Jason Grote to write, but if I've made it obvious that it repeats, yada, 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 is the power of melodrama itself and the power of like quality acting still good enough to make you, to sucker you in to like, you'd have to, it was a really cheeseball drama, but you'd have to run around the house to catch everything because, so in this case, that moment there is just at the moment of the seam where one actor gets replaced by another, and there's one moment where this actor is like, I'm leaving, I'm gonna go see the Bowie show. And then somebody else comes out of a door who they had no idea they were there, is dressed identically, and says, but you'll never get in, it's sold out. And this one is like, yeah, not a problem, and leaves. And the reason they do that and say that is because this, the setting of this was the whole problem, an idea of like fake crowds, which I kind of got into at the the inauguration, and this whole, all these issues of Soros-funded protest, which are back in the news today. It's like Soros-funded protesters, who's astroturfing, and all these questions about. And one of the things that interested me about, other than my general interest with infiltration, was, where's the line between acting as a craft, acting as a job, and just being a stand-in? There are agencies that actually do provide protesters. Like, I've spoken to them, and it's sort of like a minimum degree of acting. And the original idea that I came to the Brooklyn Museum with was to start my own. So Trump's campaign announcement was largely populated by extras. It was staffed through an extras casting agency called Extra Mile Casting. And they were subcontracted by government relations, which is PR for nonprofit campaigns and stuff, called Gotham Government Relations, which was run by Michael Cohen's lawyer. This is all back in the day. So they subcontracted to a casting agency, was saying, we need 100 extras to wave signs and wear branded T-shirts for an event at Trump Tower. Those people had no idea what they were going to. And the casting agent had no idea.
Hired actors.
They were hired. They were career extras. So, and then it turns out there's other agencies that really know what they're doing. So I got really into this, and eventually this project morphed into this idea of like somebody who'd rented out, like a failed actor, or someone who could never feel it the way you're supposed to feel it, like in LA, and they kind of like bailed out, drift to New York, and they wind up loving with this working for like a paid protest agency because they don't actually have to act. So they basically can just wave signs and listen to audiobooks. And they've rented out their subjectivity so many times that they eventually have like a psychotic break, and they wake up in this space, and they have no idea what they're doing there, and they have no idea how to get out or who they were beforehand. And then it turns into like this very kind of paranoid sci-fi freak out with a bunch of digressions on a bunch of other things. Theater included, but also fake crowdism and stuff like that.
Well, no, but where I was going with this, so the why? Okay, so that's the show at the Brooklyn Museum. Right. Why have the actors there? Why not just explain? Why did you need actors in loops?
What would the alternative have been? Oh.
I mean, what?
Oh well. There's I know what you're doing. It was originally supposed to be a different project. And and without getting too much into the specifics of it, which are completely bonkers, it was originally, as I said, I was supposed to run a fake crowd agency out of the Brooklyn Museum, who would be functionally invisible, and it caused a lot of internal rioting at the museum, and which I didn't know about. And the more I reassured them that it was fine, no one would ever know, the more upsetting it got, because I thought they were worried about it being like disruptive. Like more theatery, and I was saying no. My idols are like Lynn Hirschman Leeson and like Akanshi. These are going to be really invisible. And the more I thought I was reassuring them, the more freaked out everybody got.
So they needed the frame.
Right. So what actually happened was that finally it was like it came down to they needed visible artwork visibly being performed that was visibly in a gallery and would not spill over and infect anything else. Right, so the work really needed to be in a room, in a gallery. Visible labor needed to be being performed. There were you could not be paying people not. It turned into this like micro scandal. This was a format I developed for an exhibition in Toronto, and I actually kind of liked it. But like the way I was describing it was initially, the idea was to have artwork in a gaseous state, and you would never actually be able to catch all the particles of it because you'd never be able to see all of the people all of the time, right? And what wound up happening was it wound up, being artwork in a solid state, which is more conventional and more framed than I wanted.
And also, it sounds like you encountered the same problems you were finding in theaters in the gallery.
Like?
Well, in the same way you said, okay, in theaters they wouldn't have let me done Habit back then.
Right.
Now they kind of didn't let you do.
Well, it was.
I don't know.
Yeah, you try selling a totally invisible thing to a theater. I wound up pushing it. I wasn't like pushing it. I thought it was something that would be fun, but it actually wound up being like, everybody needs a spectacle. Everybody needs like an ROI. Everybody needs something. And I keep being like, no one will know. And they're like, we're sinking all this money and somebody has to know. So, yeah.
This reminds me.
That said,
yeah. No, it reminds me of when I went to see Private Moment at Central Park. I started all the way at the north, and they were like Creative Time patrons there, kind of with a map and everything. And the person working there, I think the intern, he was like, make sure you don't start with this one, which was the Marathon Man, because you'll miss it. You won't see anything. He's just running in loops. It's just like anybody at the park. Make sure you don't start there.
Except, you guys all seen Marathon Man? Like we were really studious about this. It's a 1970s, early 70s movie starring Dustin Hoffman. He's like this grad student at Columbia who is training for a marathon and gets caught up in all kinds of shit. But it begins with him running around the reservoir, and there is one particular moment where he kind of gives up because he's too exhausted, and he kind of swings his arm around. And so we figured out exactly where it was. We had to use the skyline, which has drastically changed. And then we found an ultra marathon runner for whom running 6 hours a day around the reservoir was nothing. And we redid Dustin Hoffman's costume. And every time on that loop, every time he would find, he'd get to that one spot and he would kind of do this very kind of, and then he'd start again. So it wasn't, the thing is but I love these ideas of like people working, like really being studious about getting this right. And yet it's really, you have to work to find it. And that was the most invisible. But the thing about that show is there were varying degrees of theatricality and visibility, and also different places were different. Like some of them were in transitional spaces, some of them were in, there was Tony Torn, who some of you might know, did a 6-hour loop from a movie called Symbio-Psycho-Taxiplasm, Take One, where this couple gets in this horrific fight on not the Bow Bridge, but the other bridge, but and like really bad, like yelling about abortions and really, really toxic language. Like she's calling him a faggot. It's terrible. And they had to have this fight over and over. Tony.
My ears were burning.
Wow. Yeah. So, and that was visible in all the kind of like weird and aggro ways. Because it was a really touristy spot, and they would just have this like horrible blowout, like 6 hours a day.
So since we only have 10 minutes, I want to make sure you get to talk about this other work, and this takes us back to that whole thing between museums and theaters. This one, I don't know if this is the best picture.
I totally forgot about that picture.
Yeah.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about this show? This was
that was
Williams
kind
College.
of a goof.
It's okay.
That was a double show. So one thing was myself, Marcia Ginsburg, Amy Holtzapfel, and Lisa Doran curated a show. Lisa Doran runs the Williams College Museum of Art, or is the chief curator there, and Amy Holtzapfel was the chair of the theater department, and Marcia Ginsburg, as you know, is an artist and set designer. So we curated an exhibition of. The question we put ourselves to is, can you do a performance exhibition that has A, no documentation, and B, no live looped performance? Can you do an exhibition about performance that has none of those things? And the answer is yes, but it's a sculpture show. So we curated this very kind of peculiar exhibition with like artworks from everyone from like Richard Serra to Ryan McNamara and Jamie Eisenstein, and it was a really beautiful show, actually. Clifford Owens, but no performance. And then we shopped. We sourced a bunch of heads, John the Baptist heads from various productions of Salome, of operas, and we peppered them throughout the exhibition. So that was one part of the show. The other part of the show was this fucking thing, which was called A People's History of Performance Art, and the idea I don't know how we got this idea, but Amy was really into tableau vivant, and I am really interested in the way like performance art documentation gets fetishized, like the photo and the affect around the photo, and like the kind of, go to Judson if you want to see what I'm talking about, like the way a photo can conjure a whole scene. The Judson show at MoMA. And so I thought it would be really funny if they did tableau vivant was like doing historical paintings, basically. That's where it came from. I thought it'd be really funny if people did tableau vivant reenactments of famous performance art photos, just because that's exactly the opposite of what performance art is supposed to be. So it turned into, because Williams is Williams and it's so fucking rich, and the whole, you know, and this room that we were doing it in was like from in a mansion. It turned into this thing where you had this society doyen, played by an actor, talking people through talking a bunch of like, you know, welcome to the local historical society, you know, here's an evening, and they were going to...
They were like stuck right there, or did they move?
No, they were going to explain the history of performance art to, you know, visitors to the Williams College Historical Society through a series of tableau vivant reenactments. So, and it went from the famous Yves Klein Leap into the Void all the way up to Marina. And the students Marcia designed this really crazy system of photographic backdrops, and the students would get into place in these really ridiculous ways while, you know, and totally unconvincing costumes, while this woman would narrate and sort of talk you through the issues involved in the canonization of performance art. And she was sort of based on, you guys ever hear of Anna Russell? She was a musical comedian from like the 60s. She was an ex-opera singer, and she did this crazy, she would do these fake society things, and so the character was kind of based on that. So it was a history of performance art in 12 tableaux vivants performed by students, but by the end of it, it goes completely kind of batshit, and like the Chris Burden, the shoe reenactment, the gun actually goes off, and like, I mean, it was like, and then they end with the artist is present. So, and then, but the thing is, the artist is present at the very end. They don't have enough spectators. They keep talking about how like the real element of composition in these images is the spectator standing behind it, which is really what makes most of these images. So, but there's not enough, it's not convincing without a bunch of people standing behind Marina and this guy, so they ask the whole audience to participate as spectators. So basically the audience just switches to the other side, and then there's no one left, and there's no one to see them, and it's done.
Well, this is a good time to open it up for questions from you, since also, you know, it's kind of intimate. Any questions? Yeah?
Yeah, I'll ask a question, just to get things rolling. So when my partners and I teach site work, we start by breaking it down between site-specific, site-responsive, and site-based. And then we'll further break that down between like promenade, immersive, street, guerrilla, half a dozen other sort of. Do you do anything in terms of creating buckets for what you consider site-specific work? Do you break it down in particular ways? And/or what do you mean by beyond site-specific?
So I am not a practitioner, and that comes from an art historical definition of, okay, site. So for those of you who don't know, site-specific is like when if I take this away from the place, then I destroy the work, kind of like bound theater. It can only exist there. Site-responsive, you're responding to the site. Like, you know, maybe perhaps the library piece, and site-based. When in my book, I don't do that so much. I'm a little more abstract. So the way I divide it is spectator sites. I'm looking at performances that that's one chapter, connect spectators within the artwork with spectators that are not, I know it sounds abstract, but I give examples in the book, that come into contact with that piece but see it differently. That's spectator sites. I talk about temporal sites, so pieces, for example, RFK Nikkei Y is a piece that John Malpe did in Eastern Kentucky. He did a real-time reenactment of Robert F. Kennedy's 1968 poverty tour. And so in that sense, yes, it's site-specific. That's the you know, of course, because you can only do it in Eastern Kentucky with people that, you know, third generation who are actually at the poverty tour. But I'm more interested in what the piece does. So that's an example of what I call a temporal site, where really what these artists are playing with is past and present, so they're connecting. That's what I mean by a kind of relational sense of how does our past connect to our present? What are we saying by going through our past about the future in this place right now? Geyserland is another example. That's a piece by Anne Carlson and I'm forgetting the name of the video artist who did Geyserland, but it's a piece that takes place in a train in Montana in 2004. So super site specific, but again, taking us through kind of the Native American histories that were destroyed by the very construction of that train. And then another chapter is urban sites. So yes, a lot of pieces that, like Reza Abdo's piece, Father Was a Peculiar Man, that I know you were involved with, but super site specific. But what I'm interested in is all these, and I use examples that took place in New York City in specific neighborhoods, but again, what are they saying about the history of gentrification, what happened to those neighborhoods, when did those performances take place? So yes to all that you're saying, I take a different approach.
I think your approach, I think, also has to do with more, sort of treating the institution itself as a site.
Yeah, that's chapter 2. Because that's David Levine is chapter 2, is situating theater. So that's where I look at disciplinary sites of artists that are doing what he's doing, where you're kind of taking theater, but you're placing it a different kind of, you're placing it in conversation with a different discipline. In this case, visual art, performance art.
Right, no, man, I think what I was saying was more that like it just seemed like you were sort of moving beyond an idea of physical site.
Yes. Oh yeah.
So that it wasn't someone that was
Yes.
So I think that's probably why a lot of terminology doesn't necessarily function in your book, because
moving away from location. Even though some artists are still using location, that's not the main emphasis.
For David, thank you both of you, but for David, I was curious about why you reacted so strongly against immersion and Sleep No More, and that like encounter that you say you don't believe in the encounter. I forget exactly which term you used, but I'm just wondering.
I think, I think like part of the reason why I tend to drift more towards like a kind of visual art or conceptual art kind of context is that perhaps what I'm saying with like, it's a total lie, but I think generally one of the premises of like, an exhibition space or that kind of thing is like, the thing you're seeing is the thing that it is. It's like really anti-mimetic, right? So it's like, if I'm gonna show you habit, I'm also gonna show you the work that goes into doing habit. And I think that what I don't like about immersive theater is the same thing that I don't like about VR, which is to say that like the promises are like you're really there, and you're not really there, and I'm not one of those people who can. And it's also the same thing I don't like about Tina Segal. Also, it's like this thing of like, I don't actually believe interaction is possible, like actual interaction is possible in the frame of a spectacle, right? So, and I think that one of the things I find really moving about theater is actually exactly that distance. I mean, one of the things I found moving generally, but especially in theater, is exactly like the incommensurability of that distance. And I don't see why you wouldn't want to use that distance as a material. So, like Fairview is a really good example of that. Like, like that, I mean, like part of the melancholy in that piece is that you actually can't get, this divide, this audience performer divide becomes a metaphor for a million other like unbridgeable kind of gaps. And I feel like Jackie's really, consistently taking what makes theater, and not taking those materials for granted, but actually taking the emotion in them and, and doing something, using them to expand other meanings of the thing. Whereas in Sleep No More or like VR, there was like, oh, the frisson is like you're in there, or like Tina Segal is like, you're having a conversation. But to me, my experience is like, I never feel like I'm in there. I feel like I'm in there, and that's not what I want. So I would rather, like I'm working on a holography piece right now, but again, it's like you can't get anywhere near it. I would never like, so that's.
Oh no, for those of you who didn't see it, Fairview was at Soho Rep. Jackie Sybil's Jury is the name of the, and at the end of the piece, you're asked to kind of go in the set, so it kind of breaks. I think that illusion is what you're talking about.
It's kind of throughout the whole thing, but at the very end, the most obvious mechanism is they ask, they would just ask the audience to put themselves in their, in their shoes, or put themselves in their place, or. But there's a lot. That's too reductive. But
in a way, that
but
piece.
They ask part of the audience
Did anybody
to get on
see
stage.
That piece? By chance? Oh, Fairview, because in a way that's kind of a site-specific piece that refers to the apparatus of theater. You know, when she. So I mean, I think that there's some pieces, and the other one I'm thinking about is at BAM, Ivo von Hove's Roman Tragedies. I don't know if people saw it, where it's done on the stage at BAM, and you would have to go on. You could leave, you could watch it, but you could be on the stage. So again, they're always like using the apparatus of theater and kind of breaking it apart for you, you know, unveiling how theater is made in a very Brechtian.
Yeah, which can work or not work, but I mean, I think, but in some cases you can really use it. So that's why, I mean, that's sort of, I just believe it's a false promise, or it's not, or people love it. It's just not the kind of free song I'm into. I'm into making people sad. I'm not into making people feel like they had an experience. So, other than one of intense sadness.
Any other? Yeah?
This will be the last one, I'm sorry.
Oops.
Ran out the clock.
My question was, you said early on that you're focused or very interested in seeing or changing how people see. Apparently you want to make them see sadness or then feel sadness, but you also said that what you're most interested in, or both of you have talked about, not simply the spectator, not simply the audience, but then the people somewhat separated from the audience, so the people who are kind of aware that they're the audience versus the people who come in and are not entirely sure what's happening or whether something's happening, like the park scene. So are you interested in seeing the audience, or like in seeing the audience see what, I think it's almost like creating art to understand how people see art and then continuously manipulate it so that that's how you're changing it.
What?
That setup.
No, I mean, I've done it in other contexts. I mean, the nemesis in that Brooklyn Museum piece, in the monologue, is this person winds up in the thrall of a demonic casting agent who may or may not be who either dropped out of art school to do a PhD or dropped out of a PhD to do art school and then wound up becoming a casting agent. And that casting agent gets crazier and crazier and crazier as the thing goes on, and finally tries to summon a demon using their extras, kind of chanting, and probably does. But that character kind of, you never see them. You just talk about their experience with this woman named Gina. But the idea of Gina came out of me being like, why the fuck do I do this? Why am I so interested in creating these situations where people have why am I interested in, the whole situation with Fake Crowd is you never know who's acting, who's standing next to you. You never actually know how, is it because I'm interested in manipulating situations? Is it because I'm interested in random situations? I'm into watching people watch? I have no answer. I don't actually know why I keep doing this.
Neither do I. On that note, thanks for coming, and
thank you, Bertie.
Thanks, David.